My uncle sent me an email on a Monday morning with a PDF attachment and a subject line that said estate update. The email said he wanted to keep the family informed and that he had been handling things on behalf of the estate and that some accounts had been transferred and consolidated and that he would provide a full accounting when everything was settled. The PDF was a brokerage account transfer form. It showed my grandmother's investment account, the account she had held for 22 years with a balance of just over $200,000 transferred to my uncle's personal account. The transfer form was signed with a power of attorney. My grandmother's name was on the form as the principal. My uncle's name was on the form as the agent. The form was dated 18 days after my grandmother had died. I looked at the date on the transfer. I want to describe what the 2 minutes after I opened the PDF felt like. I am a CPA and I have spent 15 years verifying whether the authority behind a signature existed on the date the signature was made. This is an audit procedure. You read the authorization date, you read the authority document, you verify the match. When I opened the PDF, I read the transfer date first. 11 days after my grandmother's death. I knew this date without looking it up because I had been at her house the week she died and the date was in my memory. I looked it up anyway because I am a person who verifies things I already know before I act on them. I checked the date against my grandmother's death date. 11 days. The authority behind the transfer form was my grandmother's power of attorney. A power of attorney terminates at death. The transfer had been executed 11 days after the authority terminated. The transfer was void. I understood this before I had finished reading the first page. The professional understanding arrived first. The personal understanding, which is the understanding of what it means that my uncle had done this to my grandmother's estate, arrived about 30 seconds later. I sat with both for a moment, then I called Catherine. There is a specific professional quality to reading a document and identifying the controlling date relationship before the emotional implications have arrived. I have done this in auditing contexts many times, identified an anomaly before I understood what it meant for the people involved, and then had the emotional understanding arrive 30 seconds later as the human meaning of the technical finding became clear. The technical finding here was simple. Transfer date after death date, authority terminated at death, transfer void. The human meaning was that my uncle had used my grandmother's name and her authority and her legal documents to take her money after she was gone. He had done this while the family was grieving. He had done this while we were making funeral arrangements. He had done this 11 days after we had lost her. The professional understanding took 2 minutes. The personal understanding took considerably longer. I am still working on the personal understanding. The case was resolved. The money was returned. The understanding is ongoing form. I looked at the date of my grandmother's death. I looked at the gap between them, 18 days. Then I opened my phone and I pulled up the document my cousin had sent the family when my grandmother died, which was a simple message that said she had passed and included the date. I compared the two dates. 18 days. My grandmother had been dead for 18 days when my uncle signed a transfer form using her power of attorney to move $200,000 from her investment account into his personal account. I am a certified public accountant. I have worked with estate documents and fiduciary instruments and power of attorney arrangements for 15 years, and I understood in the first 2 minutes of reading that PDF exactly what had happened and why it was not legal. A power of attorney is an authority granted by a living person to act on their behalf. The word living is not incidental. It is the foundational legal requirement. A power of attorney terminates the moment the principal dies, not a week later, not when probate is opened. The moment. When my grandmother died, every authority my uncle had held under her power of attorney ceased to exist. He had no authority to sign anything on her behalf. He had no authority to transfer her account. He had no authority to act as her agent. He had been dead to the law as her agent the moment she was dead to the world. Before I go on, if this story I want to explain what a durable power of attorney is and why the word durable does not mean what my uncle apparently believed it meant. A durable power of attorney is a specific form of POA that remains effective even if the principal becomes incapacitated. An ordinary power of attorney terminates if the principal loses mental capacity. A durable one does not. This is why people create durable powers of attorney for elder care and health planning. They want the authority to remain operative if they have a stroke or develop dementia or otherwise become unable to manage their own affairs. The durability refers specifically and only to the question of incapacity. It does not extend the power past death. Nothing extends a power of attorney past death. The law is universal and unambiguous on this point. A POA terminates at death because the foundational relationship of the document, which is the relationship between a living principal and a living agent acting on their behalf, cannot exist when the principal is no longer living. You cannot act on behalf of someone who is no longer there to be acting on behalf of. The law has never provided an exception to this, and no court in Ohio has recognized one. Gerald had moved $250,000 using an authority that had not existed for more than a week by the time he signed the first form. The death certificate established the termination date. Everything else followed from that date. I also want to explain what happens to estate administration authority after a death and why this is different from a power of attorney. After someone dies, the authority to act on behalf of the estate does not pass to the agent named in the power of attorney. It passes, through the probate court, to the executor named in the will, or, if there is no will, to an administrator appointed by the court. The executor has authority only after the probate court formally appoints them and issues letters testamentary. Before that happens, no one has the authority to distribute or transfer estate assets. The power of attorney is gone, the executor is not yet appointed. In that window, the assets belong to the estate, and the estate is in a period of transition. Gerald had acted in that window. He had moved assets using an authority that had ended before acquiring the authority that could have made his actions legitimate. If he had been named executor in the will and had waited for letters testamentary and had then distributed assets in accordance with the will, that would have been legal. He was not named executor. He had not waited. He had not distributed in accordance with the will. He had taken the assets for himself in the window when no one had the authority to stop him, except that Catherine had authority to petition the court, and I had the death certificate, and the death certificate closed the window. Connects with something real in your life? Please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. My name is Simone. I am 37 years old. And this is the story of how a single date, the date of death on my grandmother's Franklin County death certificate, established with documentary certainty that every financial action my uncle had taken under her power of attorney in the 18 days after she died had no legal basis, and what happened when an estate attorney named Catherine O.C. put that death certificate and those transfer records in front of the Franklin County probate court. Now let me take you back to the beginning, not the Monday morning email, before that. To my grandmother, Lucille, who died at 82 in the home in Columbus that she had lived in since 1986 and who had been, until the last months of her life, the most organized person in the family by a significant margin. Lucille had worked for the state of Ohio for 29 years as an administrative specialist in the Department of Education, and she had brought to her private life the same meticulous habits that had made her professionally useful to the state for nearly 3 decades. She kept records. She maintained files. She knew where every document was, and she made sure the people who would need to find things after her knew where to look. She had an estate attorney in Columbus named Barbara Park, who had prepared her will and her power of attorney documents 9 years before she died, and who had met with her every 2 years since to confirm that everything was current and that her wishes remained as she had documented them. My grandmother had 3 children. My mother, who is the eldest, my Uncle Gerald, who is the middle child and who is the person who sent me the PDF on the Monday morning, and my Aunt Patricia, who is the youngest and who had been, in the last 3 years of my grandmother's life, the child most physically present, driving her to appointments and managing her household when her mobility declined, and being, in the specific way of the child who lives closest and who has the most available time, the person who absorbed most of the daily weight of my grandmother's care. My grandmother had known this. She had acknowledged it in specific terms in conversations I had been part of, and she had discussed with Barbara Park whether the will should be adjusted to reflect Patricia's contribution. Barbara had told me later that my grandmother had decided, after careful thought, that equal distribution remained her preference and that she would provide for Patricia's extra contribution through a specific bequest of a meaningful amount rather than through a change in the overall distribution structure. This decision was in the will. It had been finalized the last time Barbara met with my grandmother. My Uncle Gerald had the power of I want to tell you about Gerald and about what I believe he understood about what he was doing. I have thought about this carefully in the months since the ruling. and I have arrived at a version of the answer that I can hold without it consuming everything else. I do not think Gerald had sat down and made a careful plan to commit financial fraud against his mother's estate. I think he had told himself a story in which what he was doing was different from what it was. He was in financial difficulty. He had been for years. He knew his share of the estate would be significant. He also knew, or believed, that the power of attorney gave him the ability to act on his mother's behalf, and he may have told himself that moving the accounts quickly was a kind of advance on what he was going to receive anyway. He may have told himself that the estate would be sorted out eventually, and that the accounting would come right, and that he was managing things in a practical way. None of this is a legal defense, and none of it is an accurate description of what a power of attorney allows you to do after the principal has died. But I think it describes how someone tells themselves a story about an action they know is wrong in order to be able to take it. The story did not survive the death certificate and the 4 transaction dates. Those facts do not accommodate alternative narratives. They are what they are. I want to say something more about my grandmother's relationship with Gerald in the last years before her death. She had known he was struggling. She had lent him money twice that I know of, and probably more times that I do not. She had not talked about these loans with the other children. She had handled Gerald's financial difficulty the way she handled most family problems, which was directly and privately and without making it the subject of wider family discussion. She had been the person who noticed what needed to be noticed and who addressed it without making the person who needed the help feel diminished by the help. I think this was part of what Gerald had told himself when he moved the accounts, that his mother had always helped him, and that this was a continuation of that pattern. But the pattern had been my grandmother making a choice to help him. What he had done was make that choice himself after her death without her consent, using an authority that did not exist. Those are not the same thing. They are not even similar things. One is a gift. The other is theft from an estate. The death certificate drew the line between them clearly. The line was the date of death. Everything before it had been her choice. Everything after it had been his. Judge Achebe had read the same line. He had ruled accordingly. Attorney. My grandmother had given it to him 4 years before she died in the specific context of a health scare that had required surgery and that had made her feel for the first time that she needed someone to have legal authority to act on her behalf during a period of incapacity. She had chosen Gerald because he was geographically closer than my mother and because at the time she had judged him reliable. The power of attorney was a durable power of attorney, which means it remained effective even if she became incapacitated. It was explicitly not effective after death. No power of attorney is effective after death. This is not a nuance of the law. It is the foundational principle of what a power of attorney is, the authority of one living person to act on behalf of another living person. When the principal dies, the living person who granted the authority is gone, and with them goes the authority. I called Catherine Osei the morning I want to say something about my grandmother and about the specific conversation in which she had told me about the file cabinet. We had been in her kitchen, and she had been making tea, and she had said, with the directness she always used for things she wanted remembered, that she wanted me to know where the file cabinet was, and that the legal folder was in the front of the top drawer, and that if something happened, I should look there first. She had said Barbara Park's name, and she had said the phone number was on the letter in the folder. She had said this not as a dramatic conversation about mortality, but as a practical transfer of operational information, the way she had always communicated the things she considered important, directly and without ceremony. She had made her tea. We had talked about other things. I had written down Barbara Park's name in my phone notes before I left that day because I am a person who writes down the things people tell me when they mean for me to remember them. She had known I would write it down. She had told me specifically because she knew I would write it down, and because writing it down was what she needed someone to do. She had matched the information to the person who would keep it. I had kept it. It was the first thing I found when I went to the house. It was exactly where she had said it would be. I also wanted to say something about what the termination at death clause in the power of attorney meant in the context of the case. Barbara had included the clause explicitly because she had seen the ambiguity that agents sometimes claimed when the clause was not explicit. Having the clause in the document meant that Gerald's attorney could not argue that the termination was implied rather than stated, or that a durable POA had special post-death properties. The clause said directly that the authority terminated at death, and the clause was in the document that Gerald had signed as agent when he accepted the authority 4 years earlier. He had agreed to the terms. The terms included the termination clause. The termination clause said when the authority ended. The death certificate said when that end had occurred. The two documents together were the entire legal argument. Barbara had written the clause to be unambiguous. It had been unambiguous. Lucille had kept the document where it could be found. I had found it and photographed it and sent it to Catherine. That was the chain. It had held received the PDF. I had looked her up before I called. She had been practicing estate law in Columbus for 14 years and had been recommended by 2 colleagues in my accounting network as the attorney they would call for a contested estate matter in Franklin County. I described the transfer form and the dates. She said, "Send me the form and the death certificate." I sent the brokerage transfer form from the PDF my uncle had sent. I called the Franklin County Vital Statistics Office for a certified copy of the death certificate. Ohio death records are maintained at the county level, and a certified copy of a death certificate can be obtained from the county health department or the Ohio Department of Health by a qualifying family member. I had a certified copy within 3 business days. I sent it to Catherine. She called me back. She said the form is dated 18 days after the death date on the certificate. She said that is the entire case. She said everything your uncle signed under the power of attorney after the date of death is void because the power of attorney was void as of the moment of death. She said the transfer of the investment account is void. She said any other transfers or actions he took under the power of attorney after the death date are void. She said, I want to know if there were other actions. She said, get the full account history for every account your grandmother held and look for any transactions dated after her death that your uncle authorized. I got the histories within the week. There were 3 additional transactions, 2 smaller account transfers, and a withdrawal from a checking account. All 4 transactions had occurred in the 18-day window between her death and the day my uncle sent me the PDF announcing that he had been handling things. Catherine filed a petition in Franklin County Probate Court to void all 4 transactions and to recover the transferred funds to the estate. She submitted the death certificate with the date of death. She submitted the brokerage transfer form with its execution date 18 days later. She submitted the additional account transaction records with their dates. She submitted a sworn statement from Barbara Park confirming that the power of attorney had been prepared by her office, that it was a standard durable power of attorney effective during incapacity but terminating at death, and that Barbara had not been consulted about or involved in any of the post-death transactions. She submitted my sworn statement describing my receipt of the PDF and my identification of the date discrepancy. She submitted the Franklin County death certificate as the foundational document establishing the date of death from which everything else derived. She also filed an emergency motion to I want to say something about the emergency account freeze and why it was the most important procedural step in the first 48 hours after Catherine filed the petition. Gerald had access to the remaining accounts. He had moved 4 transactions in 18 days, and there was no obvious reason he would stop before the estate was formally open and his access was legally restricted. Catherine said the freeze was urgent because every day without it was a day in which additional funds could be moved. She filed the emergency motion simultaneously with the petition. The court granted the freeze within 48 hours. The financial institutions were served with the freeze order and the certified death certificate within the day after the court granted it. The accounts were frozen before any additional transfers occurred. The total that needed to be recovered was $252,000, which was the amount of the 4 transactions that had already occurred. If we had waited a week to file, or if we had not sought the emergency freeze, the number could have been larger. Catherine had moved fast because she understood that the evidence was clear and that the risk of additional harm was real. The fast movement protected the estate. The freeze order held until the ruling. Everything that had been taken was returned. Nothing additional was lost. I also want to say something about what the recovery of the funds meant in practical terms for the estate. $252,000 was most of my grandmother's liquid financial assets. She had spent 29 years as a state employee contributing to her pension and saving in her investment accounts with the specific discipline of someone who had grown up without financial security and who had built it through consistent, deliberate effort over decades. She had not spent extravagantly. She had not taken lavish vacations or bought expensive things. She had saved and invested and maintained her house and paid her bills and done the compound interest work of a long accumulation period. The result of that work was the estate she had built. Gerald had moved most of it in 11 days. The court had returned it. The estate was administered as she had intended. Her 3 children each received their equal share. Patricia received the additional bequest she had earned. My grandmother's 30 years of careful saving produced the result she had worked toward. The record she had maintained made sure it did. That is what the record is for, to protect the work of a lifetime from the people who would undo it in the gap between death and distribution. Freeze any accounts to which my uncle had access pending the court's review, on the grounds that additional transactions might occur before the petition was heard. The court granted the freeze within 48 hours. My uncle's attorney filed a response arguing that Gerald had believed he retained authority under the power of attorney to handle transition matters during the estate settlement period, and that he had been acting in good faith in the family's interest. Catherine's reply was direct. She said Ohio law does not recognize a good faith extension of a power of attorney beyond the principal's death. She said the law is not ambiguous on this point. She said a durable power of attorney terminates at death. She said the specific language of this power of attorney, which Barbara had prepared, included an explicit termination at death clause. She said Gerald had signed a document transferring $200,000 out of the estate using an authority that had not existed for 18 days. She said good faith is not a legal basis for the exercise of an authority that the law does not recognize. She said the transactions were void. She said the funds belonged to the estate and to the beneficiaries under the will. The Franklin County Probate Court assigned the matter to Judge Raymond Ashby, who had been presiding over probate matters in Franklin County for 9 years. He reviewed the submissions. At the hearing, he asked Gerald's attorney one question: what is the legal authority under which a power of attorney remains operative after the principal's death? The attorney said he did not have a case supporting this position. Judge Achebe said he had reviewed Ohio Revised Code and the relevant case law, and he had not found any such authority either because no such authority existed. He said the power of attorney had terminated at the moment of death as documented by the death certificate. He said every transaction executed under it after that moment was without legal basis. He voided all 4 transactions. He ordered the funds returned to the estate. He referred the matter to the Franklin County prosecutor for review of whether the circumstances warranted criminal investigation. My grandmother's estate was administered under her will. The assets were distributed equally to her 3 children, with the specific bequest to my Aunt Patricia, reflecting the contribution my grandmother had acknowledged and documented with Barbara. The investment account balance plus the recovered amounts from the other transactions was distributed as my grandmother had intended. I want to say something before I go. I want to say something about the CPA's perspective on the month after a death and about what the presence of a valid will and a retained estate attorney does to protect an estate during that period. The month after a death is when estates are most vulnerable. The formal probate process has not yet been opened. The executor has not yet been appointed by the court. The accounts are still in the decedent's name. Financial institutions are in a transitional state with respect to the accounts. People with access through pre-existing arrangements such as a power of attorney still appear in the institution's systems as authorized agents. An agent who understands this window and who is willing to act in it before the estate is formally under the court's supervision can move assets in the gap between death and probate. This is what Gerald had done. The defense against it is speed, retaining an estate attorney immediately after death, filing for probate promptly, and being alert to any account activity in the days after death. If you have access to the account history for the decedent's accounts in the weeks after death, review them for any transactions that were not your own. If you find transactions you did not authorize and did not know about, the date of death is the key. If the transaction was after the date of death and was signed under a power of attorney, the authority for that transaction did not exist. Not about Gerald and not about the prosecutor. About why the death certificate is the foundational document in any case involving post-death use of a power of attorney, and about what the date of death means legally. When a person dies in Ohio, a death certificate is filed with the county health department within a specific number of days. The death certificate records the date of death as established by the attending physician or the coroner. That date is a legal fact. It is recorded in the public record. It is accessible by qualifying family members as a certified copy. When someone uses a power of attorney after that date, The death certificate is the document that establishes the gap between when their authority ended and when they acted. You do not need anything else. The date of death and the date of the action are two numbers. If the action date is after the death date, the authority did not exist. The math is as simple as the law is clear. I am an accountant. I understand dates and the relationships between them. The dates told me what had happened before I had finished reading the first page of the PDF. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story made you feel something, write it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to hear the story of a woman whose cousin had been writing checks to herself from her late father's checking account for 11 months after he died, claiming she was paying estate expenses, and what the estate accounting the probate court required showed about which payments had been submitted for approval and which had not, it is waiting for you in the description below. Click it. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And if someone in your family is acting as agent under a power of attorney for a person who has died, every action they take under that authority is without legal basis. The death certificate establishes the date of death. Any transaction dated after the death date, authorized under the power of attorney, is void. Request the certified death certificate from the County Vital Statistics Office or the Ohio Department of Health. Compare the death date to the transaction dates. If the transactions came after the death, the authority for them did not exist. The record is the evidence. The date of death is the line. Everything after that line was unauthorized. I want to tell you more about Lucille and about what the house in Columbus looked like and what 34 years of her specific attention had done to it. The house was a 2-story brick colonial in a neighborhood on the east side of Columbus where the streets were tree-lined and the lots were generous, and the houses had been built in the post-war decades by people who expected to stay and whose successors had largely done so. Lucille had kept the house with the specific standards of a person who had spent her working life in an organization that valued order and accuracy and who had carried those values home every evening for 29 years. The interior was organized in ways that visitors sometimes found startling, not because it was sparse or cold, but because everything in it was in a place that reflected a specific logic that Lucille had developed and maintained and that worked. The kitchen had the workflow of a professional kitchen without any of the commercial equipment. The file cabinet in the second bedroom had 34 years of property records, tax documents, insurance policies, and correspondence organized by year and by type. The legal folder at the front of the file cabinet had the will and the power of attorney and the advance directive and the letter from Barbara Park confirming the currency of all three as of the most recent review meeting. I had known about that file cabinet my entire adult life because, Lucille, I want to describe what it was like to go through my grandmother's file cabinet in the days after she died and what the experience of finding everything exactly where she said it would be meant to me. I had driven to Columbus from Cincinnati the day after she died, and I had gone to the house and I had started with the file cabinet because that was what she had told me to do. The cabinet was in the second bedroom that she had always used as an office. It was a 4-drawer metal filing cabinet in the color that filing cabinets are, and the drawers opened smoothly because she had maintained it the way she maintained everything. The top drawer had the legal folder at the front, exactly as she had said. The legal folder was labeled Legal Documents in her handwriting. Inside, it was the will, with a sticky note in her handwriting that said current as of the meeting date. The power of attorney was behind the will. The advance directive was behind that. Barbara Park's letter confirming the currency of all three was behind the advance directive. I read the power of attorney while I was standing at the cabinet. I found the termination at death clause on the first page. It was in plain language, and it said exactly what it said. I took a photograph of it with my phone. I took photographs of all 4 documents. Then I called Catherine. She was already expecting the call because I had left a message on her service the night before. Everything was where it was supposed to be. My grandmother had made sure of that. I had only needed to go and find it. I also want to say something about the specific items in the other drawers of the file cabinet and what they told me about my grandmother. The second drawer had 34 years of property tax receipts and insurance renewal documents organized by year. The third drawer had medical records and annual folders, each labeled with the year and containing the summary documents from her physicians for that year. The fourth drawer had financial statements going back 20 years, the kind that a person keeps because they believe the record of how money was managed is part of the record of a life. All of it was in order. All of it was labeled. All of it was findable. She had not kept these records because she expected to need them. She had kept them because keeping them was how she lived. The cabinet was the expression of a person whose relationship to information was that information mattered, and that information which mattered should be kept where it could be found. The will was in the cabinet, the POA was in the cabinet, the termination clause was in the POA. The estate was protected because the cabinet existed, and because she had told me where it was. She had been right to tell me. I had been right to go there first. The cabinet held everything that mattered for the case. I had only needed to arrive and open it. Had told me about it with the same specific intention that Vera had told Adazi about the drawer, and that Dennis had maintained his kitchen drawer notebook. The intention of a person who understands that organized records are the mechanism by which your intentions survive you, and who takes the time to make sure the people who need to find things can find them. She had told me about the file cabinet because she knew I worked with estate documents and financial records, and because she trusted me to understand what I found when I found it. She had been right to trust me. I found what was in the file cabinet within the first hour of being at the house after she died, and what I found was what she had put there, which was everything I needed, in the right order, with the right labels. I want to say something about the 18-day window and about what my uncle had done with it. He had begun executing the transfers within the first week after my grandmother's death. The brokerage transfer form was the largest transaction, and it had been executed 11 days after her death. The checking account withdrawal had been executed 14 days after her death. The two smaller account transfers had been executed on the same day as the brokerage transfer, 11 days out. 4 transactions in the first 2 weeks. He had moved quickly. I think he had believed that acting quickly, before the estate was formally opened and before an attorney had been retained, would give him a window in which the transactions would be completed and the money would be in his account before anyone looked closely at the dates. He had sent the PDF on day 18, the Monday morning email, which I think was his attempt to get ahead of the situation by framing what he had done as administrative management rather than what it actually was. The email had said he wanted to keep the family informed. It had used the phrase consolidated accounts. It had been designed to sound like estate management. It was not estate management. Estate management is conducted by the executor under the authority of the probate court, not by an agent under a power of attorney that had ceased to exist on the day the principal died. I want to tell you about what it was like to be a CPA reading that PDF and understanding what the dates meant. I have spent 15 years working with financial documents and the relationship between dates and authority, and I have the professional habit of reading dates first and working backward to the question of whether the authority existed on the date the action was taken. This is a standard audit procedure. You verify that the person who signed had the authority to sign on the date they signed. The authority question in this case was simple. Did Gerald have authority to act as Lucille's agent on the date he executed these transfers? The death, I want to say something about what the Franklin County death certificate looks like and about the specific process of obtaining a certified copy in Ohio. Ohio death records are filed with the county health district where the death occurred and are also maintained at the state level by the Ohio Department of Health Vital Statistics Office. A certified copy can be obtained from either the county or the state. The county is often faster. A certified copy has an official seal or stamp from the issuing office and a registrar's signature, and it carries legal authentication that makes it acceptable as evidence in court proceedings and to financial institutions. An uncertified copy, sometimes called an informational copy, does not carry the same weight and should not be relied on for legal purposes. When you request a certified copy, you need to establish your qualifying relationship to the decedent, typically as a family member. Immediate family members and other qualifying persons can request copies online, by mail, or in person. The fee is modest. The processing time for an online request is typically 3 to 5 business days. In a case involving unauthorized post-death transactions where time matters, calling the county health department directly and explaining the urgency may result in expedited processing. Catherine had told me to ask for expedited processing, and I had. The certificate arrived in 3 business days. It said what it needed to say. We filed the petition the same afternoon. I also want to mention that financial institutions are required to stop honoring a power of attorney when they receive notice of the principal's death. They do not always receive this notice promptly unless someone tells them. The death certificate is the standard document that triggers the financial institution's recognition of the death. When Catherine submitted the freeze motion and the court granted it, the certified death certificate was served alongside the order. The institutions were notified simultaneously of the death date and the court's direction to freeze. They complied. If you are in the immediate period after a family member's death and you are concerned about account activity, the fastest single action you can take is to notify the financial institutions directly with a copy of the death certificate and ask them to note the date of death in their systems. Most institutions will flag the account for review and will require authorization through the estate rather than through the pre-existing POA. This does not replace a court freeze order, but it buys time, and it is something you can do on day one without waiting for an attorney to file. Certificate answered this question without ambiguity. He had not. The authority had terminated 18 days before the brokerage transfer form, 11 days before to be precise about the first transaction. The date of death was the line. Every transaction was on the wrong side of the line. I understood this in about 2 minutes of reading the PDF. Then I called Catherine. I want to describe the experience of working with Catherine Osei and what her 14 years of Franklin County estate work gave her in terms of practical understanding of how these cases move through the court. She had a specific quality that I noticed from the first conversation, which is that she organized her presentation of the facts in the most efficient possible order. She did not build to the central point. She led with it. She said the form is dated after the death certificate. She said that is the case. She said everything else is support for that case and we will gather the support. But the center is the two dates and the gap between them. She said courts that handle contested estate matters see post-death POA use with some regularity and that the law is settled and that Judge Achebe would recognize the pattern immediately. She said the most important thing was to move quickly to freeze any remaining accounts before additional transfers could occur. She said we have the PDFs you received. We have the death certificate coming. We file as soon as the certificate arrives. I said it arrives in 3 days. She said good. She said I am drafting the petition now. I also want to say something about Barbara Park and about what it meant that she had prepared the power of attorney with the explicit termination at death clause, and that she had maintained the file for 9 years. Barbara had prepared the document and she had been meticulous about what it said and what it did not say. The power of attorney was a durable power of attorney, which is a specific legal form that remains effective even during the principal's incapacity. But like all powers of attorney, it terminated at death. The document said this explicitly because Barbara had learned over the course of her practice that explicit language in these documents reduced the ambiguity that people like Gerald sometimes claimed when they had an interest in claiming it. She said to me when I called her that she had drafted the termination clause specifically because she had seen cases where agents had attempted to argue that a durable power of attorney's durability extended past death. She said she always included the clause and she always explained it clearly to the principal. She said Lucille had understood it clearly. She said Lucille had specifically asked about it at the signing meeting because she wanted to make sure there was no ambiguity about what happened to the authority after she was gone. Barbara said Lucille had said I want it to stop when I stop. Barbara had said it does. The clause said it did. It had. I want to tell you about the day my grandmother had the power of attorney prepared and why she had chosen Gerald to hold it. The health scare 4 years before her death had been a cardiac arrhythmia that had required a brief hospitalization and a procedure and a period of recovery during which she had not been fully capable of managing her own affairs. It had frightened her, and it had precipitated the conversation with Barbara about incapacity planning. She had chosen Gerald because he was the child who lived in Columbus, and because at that time he had seemed to her to be the reliable one, the one who called on schedule and who showed up when he said he would, and who had not yet revealed the specific combination of financial difficulty and willingness to act on that difficulty that would eventually produce the Monday morning PDF. She had made a reasonable choice given what she knew. What she had not known was what the next 4 years would reveal about the limits of his reliability. She had included the termination at death clause because she was a careful person, and she had kept the original document in the file cabinet under legal documents because she kept everything where it could be found. I also want to say something about the account histories and what they showed when I obtained them. The brokerage account was the largest by far at just over $200,000. The 2 smaller transfers were from a savings account and a money market account, and they totaled approximately $38,000. The checking account withdrawal was for $14,000. The total of the 4 transactions was approximately $252,000. This was not a modest sum. This was most of the liquid financial assets my grandmother had accumulated over a lifetime of careful saving on a state employee's salary. She had saved consistently and invested conservatively, and had managed her money with the same methodical attention she had applied to everything I want to tell you about my Aunt Patricia and about what it meant to her that the estate was administered as my grandmother had intended. Patricia had been the one who was there. She had driven to every appointment for 3 years. She had managed the house when my grandmother could not manage it herself. She had been present in the specific way that is not measurable in hours or reimbursable in any direct financial sense, but that shapes the last years of a person's life in ways that matter. My grandmother had seen this and had made the decision about the specific bequest because she wanted to acknowledge what Patricia had given without changing the fundamental structure she had always planned. The bequest was in the will. The will was valid. The will was administered. Patricia received what my grandmother had decided she should receive. When I told Patricia about the bequest, which she had not known about because my grandmother had kept it as a surprise, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That sounds like something Mom would do." She said she always noticed the things people didn't talk about. I said yes. I said she had been paying attention her whole life. Patricia said, "I know." She said that was just who she was. I said yes. I said that was who she was. We sat with it for a moment. The estate had done what she had designed it to do. Patricia had received what she had earned without ever expecting to receive anything. I want to say one more thing about Patricia. She had not known what Gerald had done until I told her. She had been managing the household in the days after the death and had not been monitoring the financial accounts because that had not been her role, and because she had been focused on the immediate practical demands of the period after a parent's death, which are considerable and which fall disproportionately on the child who was physically closest. When I told her about the transfers, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said I should have been watching the accounts. I said no. I said that was not your job, and there is no world in which it should have needed to be your job in the first 2 weeks after your mother died. I said you were doing the work that needed to be done, and the account monitoring was my job because I am the accountant in the family, and it is always my job. She said, "Thank you for catching it." I said yes. I said, "Mom told me where the file cabinet was." Patricia said, "Of course she did." She said, "Mom always knew which person to tell which thing." I said yes. I said she matched the information to the person. Patricia said she always did. We sat with that for a moment. The statement was true, and we both knew it. It was the truest thing about her. And the result was an estate that was meaningful by any measure. Gerald had moved $252,000 in 11 to 14 days under an authority that had terminated at the moment of his mother's death. The account history showed the transactions with the dates and the authorization names and the amounts. The dates were all after the death certificate date. Catherine submitted them all. I want to say something about my grandmother and about what she had been like in the last years before she died, and about whether she had known at the end what Gerald was capable of. I think she knew something. She had told me in the last year, in a conversation that had the specific quality of a statement intended to be remembered, that she was glad I knew where the file cabinet was and what was in it. She had said this in a context that was partly about estate planning generally, but that had a specific directional quality, as if she was telling me something about the file cabinet in anticipation of a specific need, rather than as a general observation. She had always been careful about whom she trusted with which pieces of her life. She had trusted me with the knowledge of the file cabinet. She had trusted Barbara with the preparation of the documents. She had given Gerald the power of attorney because she had needed someone to hold it, and because at the time of the decision he had been the available person. I do not think she had anticipated the full scope of what he would do with it after she was gone. But I think she had understood enough to make sure the record was in order and that the people who needed to find things could find them. That was what she had always done. The record was in order. We found what we needed. The rest followed from that. There is something I want to say about what the recovery of the estate assets meant for my Aunt Patricia. Patricia had been the one who had absorbed the weight of the last 3 years of my grandmother's care. She had driven to appointments and managed the household and been present in the specific relentless way of the caregiver who is not in a paid role and who does not keep track of the hours because keeping track would make the care feel transactional when the care was not transactional, but was instead an expression of love and duty and the particular bond that develops between a person and the parent they have accompanied through the last stages of life. My grandmother had known this and had decided on the specific bequest because she wanted to acknowledge it in a way that had meaning without changing the fundamental equal distribution she had always planned. That bequest was in the will. The will was administered. Patricia received what my grandmother had intended her to receive. The record had held what she had decided. The recovery of the assets made it possible. I also want to tell you about the hearing and about what it felt like to sit in the Franklin County Probate Court and watch Judge Akabe ask the question that had no answer. The courtroom had the quality that probate courts have, which is the quality of a room designed for the orderly resolution of matters that are not orderly for the families involved. The furniture is institutional, and the lighting is fluorescent, and the procedural rhythm is the rhythm of a court that handles many cases in a day, and that has developed the efficiency that comes from dealing with the same categories of matter for years. Judge Akabe had read everything before the hearing. He asked the one question. Gerald's attorney did not have an answer because there was no answer, because Ohio law had not provided one and was not going to. I had known from the moment Catherine submitted the petition that the hearing would go this way. The question would be asked, the answer would not come, the ruling would follow. It followed. Judge Akabe's voice had the specific even quality of a judge who is confirming something that the law had already established rather than breaking new ground. He said the power of attorney terminated at death. He said the transactions were void. He said the funds would be returned to the estate. He said it in about 4 minutes. I want to say something about the Franklin County Probate Court and about what it means to have a court system specifically designed to handle the administration and protection of estates. Franklin County is in central Ohio, and the county seat is Columbus, and the probate court in Franklin County handles a significant volume of estate and guardianship and other probate matters each year because Columbus is a large city with a large population, and the court has developed the specific institutional expertise that comes from handling these matters at scale. Judge Akabe had been on the bench for 9 years and had seen post-death POA use before. He had not needed to be educated about why it was impermissible. He had applied the law he knew to the facts he had. The law was clear. The facts were documented. The result was the only result the law allowed. Courts that have done specialized work for a long time do that work correctly when the facts are in order. The facts were in order. Catherine had put them in order. Judge Akabe confirmed what they established. I want to say one last thing about what my grandmother had given me without knowing she would need to give it. She had told me about the file cabinet. She had maintained it in the way it needed to be maintained. She had included the legal folder with the will and the power of attorney and the termination at death clause and the letter from Barbara confirming their currency. She had organized all of it so that a person who knew where to look would find what they needed. She had been a state employee for 29 years and a homeowner for 34 and a mother and grandmother for decades. And in all of those roles, she had been a person who kept the record right and kept the record findable. The record had protected her estate. It had protected what she had intended. It had given me the documents I needed before I needed them. She had not known I would need them for this purpose. She had kept them right anyway. That is what it means to maintain the record. You keep it right before you know the reason, and when the reason arrives, the record is ready. Hers was ready. The estate was protected. What she had worked for was distributed as she had intended. The file cabinet was empty when I finished going through it. Every document had done what it was supposed. I want to end with something about my grandmother's file cabinet and what is still in it. I have the file cabinet. I took it after the house was sold because Patricia and my mother had agreed that I should have it, and because there was a specific rightness to the person who had used it to protect the estate being the one who kept it. The cabinet is in my home office. The original drawers are empty now. I have refilled them with my own records, organized the way she organized hers, which is to say by year and by type, and with labels that are accurate and tabs that are findable. I did not plan to organize my records this way. I had my own system before. But when I started filling the cabinet, I found that her system was better than mine, and that adopting it was the natural thing to do. She had spent 29 years developing a system that worked, and I have adopted it in the cabinet she left me. The legal folder is at the front of the top drawer. It is labeled legal documents in my handwriting. The will is in it. The power of attorney is in it. The estate documents are in it. Everything is where it can be found. She taught me this without teaching me this. The cabinet was the lesson. I am still learning it. I expect I always will. I want to be clear that what I am doing when I maintain that cabinet is not simply keeping files. I am practicing the thing she practiced for 34 years, which is the belief that organized records are a form of care, that keeping things where they can be found is an act of responsibility toward the people who will need to find them. She had cared for us in many ways throughout her life, and the file cabinet was one of them. It was the care she provided after she could no longer provide any other kind. The documents had done their work, the estate had been administered as she intended. $252,000 had been recovered and distributed as she had planned. Patricia had received what she had earned. The record had protected the people. The record was built to protect. I keep the cabinet because keeping it right is the least I can do with what she gave me. The drawer is organized, the labels are accurate, the legal folder is at the front. The record is ready for whoever needs it next to do.